Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Chee-Tash. My name is Chris, and today we are talking about Clean Code by Robert C. Martin. Chapter 4, all about comments. If you guys remember last time, we talked about Chapter 3, which was all about functions. Some of the main points from that chapter were that when you are writing functions, in whatever language you're using, Java, C#, JavaScript, what have you, there's a couple important points to note. Functions should be small. Functions should really only do one thing. And we talked about there's this term abstraction, which I was kind of, if you watched that video, I was a little bit confused on. But really, abstraction is just how many things is it doing? That's like really the simplest way to look at what an abstraction is. And that is how Robert refers to it in that chapter. How many things are your function doing? How many things is your function doing? How many things is your function doing? Yeah, that's the way to put it. It should really only be doing one thing. And your function should be named properly in order to describe the function, no pun intended, that they are providing. So they should be small. They should be well named. They should really only be doing one thing. You shouldn't have a lot of nested or not a lot of indentations in your function. And there was one other really, really important point that I was going to bring up in regards to functions. Oh my gosh, what was it? Don't repeat yourself. Well, yes, that is very true. Extract, command, query. Oh, no side effects. That's another one. So your function, to go along with it doing only one thing, you should make sure that there's not any hidden side effects. So there's not anything in the code that potentially does another thing. But the other one, and I just had it here, was, the arguments. Typically, and this was very surprising, that your functions should really they shouldn't have any arguments. They shouldn't have any arguments being passed into them, which I thought was really interesting. 0 is the best, 1 is next best, 2, 3, more than that you want to avoid. So I thought that was really interesting because there's a lot of instances where I write functions that have many different arguments. So anyway, that was last time. Today we're going to talk about comments. Comments, so the // the notations that you write in your code. And as an example, I just checked in some code last week for a story that I was working on, and I had some comments on it. And first thing in the peer review process is, hey, delete these comments. So we're going to talk about kind of why you should do that, why you should limit your comments. And Uncle Bob says that nothing can be as helpful as a well-placed comment, but also on the other side of it, nothing can clutter up a module more than a frivolous, dogmatic comment. So they are your own, they're the best thing and the worst thing at the exact same time, seemingly. And in all honesty, you should barely even be using them. If I were to pretty much like summarize what you should do with comments. So Robert goes on, the proper use of comments is to compensate for our failure to express ourselves in code. Their use is not a cause for celebration. Really, what it boils down to is that if you are naming your variables, your functions, your classes properly and descriptively, you won't have a need for comments, except in very rare exception cases. And you just want to be careful with comments because sometimes comments can be left in the code. They can become quote unquote orphaned, and the comments end up being older than the code itself. So when you go to make changes to the code, you leave the comments end up being older than the code, and then they just cause confusion in your repository because the code gets modified, but the comments don't. And in reality, what I mean by modified, comments shouldn't be really modified. They should really just kind of be taken out. So again, comments do not make up for bad code. If you are finding yourself commenting a lot of things and writing comments, what that really should signal is that you should really just clean up your code. You should name your variables better. You should get rid of some nested structures. You should make sure that your functions are only doing one thing or your classes are only doing one thing. There shouldn't be a need for extensive commenting. You should really just want to explain yourself through the code. And this is an example in the book that Uncle Bob talks about. So he says, there are certainly times when code makes a poor vehicle for explanation. Unfortunately, many programmers have taken this to mean that code is seldom, if ever, a good means for explanation. So which would you rather see? The top one, and I'm sorry here, I was supposed to have a comment here. So the top bullet point, if employee.flags and hourly flag, and employee.age greater than 65, and there should be a comment above that. Check to see if the employee is eligible for full benefits. So just pretend I have a comment above this sub-bullet point. Would you rather see a comment, or would you rather see the second bullet point there? Is eligible for full benefits. Boom. The function is explaining exactly what you need to know, and there's no need for a comment here. And like Uncle Bob says, the only true good comment is the one you don't write or find a way to get rid of. And yes, there are times where comments are justified. Case in point here, legal comments. Legal comments are, well, they are legal. So basically, just as it reads right there, legal, trademarks, copyrights, all rights reserved, those things are okay to leave in comments in your code. If you do have some sort of trademark in your code, I actually didn't know that code could be trademarked, but there could be instances where you have something trademarked in your repository and it's okay to leave a comment there, a copyright, the year, all rights reserved, etc., etc. It shouldn't identify the contract terms or like anything more specific, but just to let the user know that whatever they are looking at is subject to a copyright. So that's one instance where comments could serve, a fairly decent purpose. But there's some other times where maybe it could serve a purpose, maybe in this example. So there's informative comments where you could have comments that show an example of a return or what is expected. So in this example, you have this input and you have this pattern. I don't think I copied the screenshot fully here. But essentially, you could be doing regex here. And you could be looking for a date time format exactly like that string input right here. And maybe you have a comment that is commenting on the exact pattern that you're looking for. That could be an acceptable use of a comment because maybe somebody looking at it wouldn't exactly know that, we're supposed to have a month, day, year, and then hours and minutes date time format. So that could be a potential use case of a comment, is to show you what you are expecting to return. But again, if your function is written in a certain way, you might not need that comment. You could explain what your function is returning based on the descriptive name that you're using for your function. So again, continuing forward, there's this use case of an explanation of intent. So basically explaining what your function or whatever piece of code is going to be doing. Maybe you're explaining the parameters and what it's returning, the purpose of it, and that's what this code block here is for. So you can see here we have this function calculate total price. The explanation of the intent of calculate total price is, well, it calculates the total price of an order. This function takes in a list of items and their quantities, multiplies them together. You have these param annotations. You have a return annotation. And this could be a use case for comments. But again, I would maybe argue, and maybe Uncle Bob would argue, that the function name tells you exactly everything you need to know. And perhaps the arguments, you can infer from the arguments exactly what's going to be going on here. Calculating the total price, it's returning a double, you know that, so it's returning total price. Maybe this large code block here might not even be needed. Might not even be needed, but again, maybe in exception scenarios where you're having maybe a really hard time naming a comment, and lo and behold, you need to use, or excuse me, you have a hard time naming your function. Lo and behold, you got to use comments to explain the intent or to clarify. So sometimes it can be easier to explain the meaning of an obscure argument or return value into something more readable. So sometimes maybe it's easier to just make a comment and explain the meaning of a piece of code versus just spending a bunch of time trying to name it properly. Okay, and that's fair, but be careful, says Uncle Bob, because sometimes clarifying comments can be wrong or inaccurate. Remember, like we said earlier, sometimes when comments become orphaned and code changes, the comments don't change along with the code, so you can end up having comments that went with old code that is no longer there. So therefore, it is inaccurate. It could potentially cause people to get confused. So you can imagine, here, let's read this. Returns the average value of an array of integers. This function calculates the average value of the given array by summing up all the elements and dividing the sum by the total count. Average equals sum divided by count. This is pretty good, actually. I would say that the comment block there is pretty accurate if I'm looking at the function name and guessing that it is doing exactly that. Now, if the function name was called calculate quotient, this comment would be not clarifying. It would be very confusing because it's describing an average, but the function name is describing you dividing two numbers and getting the value from the division. So either the function name would have to change, probably the easiest way to go, or you'd have to rewrite that block of comments. So, warning of consequences. Warning of consequences. Uncle Bob writes, letting somebody know that a piece of code can be volatile, yield unexpected results, or take too long to run. So, again, another use case for comments. Sometimes you want to let people know that a piece of code might not yield what you're expecting it to yield, or it might take too long to run, or it might give you... Did I already mention unexpected results? I might be repeating myself, but this could be a potential, again, another potential use case of comments when you want to say, for example, okay, hey, we're using a simple date format and we're converting just a string variable into a simple date format, but the simple date format is not thread safe. And you just want to make that comment in there because it's from just using descriptive names and such that, hey, the thread safety here is a concern. So yeah, maybe it would make sense to use a comment here. And then also follow-up comments. So we need to create each instance independently. Again, something that clarifies why, and this was kind of taken from the book. I didn't include this, like a picture of this example, but this would kind of explain why we are building a new simple date format every single time. So again, kind of to go along with the clarification bullet point from the previous slide, just clarifying when things can be volatile, when your functions can expect to not return typical results, or when stuff takes way too long to run. I've seen this before in tests we run where we have wait statements where we wait like a few seconds, and I've seen comments that say, oh, bump it up to 10 seconds if you find that the test is failing, something like that. So warning of consequences. Now there's also to-dos. And to-dos are basically comments that say that you need to fix a certain piece of code. To-dos in a lot of modern IDEs often you can find a list of them. You can get your IDE to generate a list of all the to-dos in your repository so you can look at them, and that way you can go back and say, okay, these are all the stuff we have to do in order to fix up the code. Uncle Bob writes, to-dos explain why the function has a degenerate implementation and what the function's future should be. Essentially, they're explaining jobs that need to be done to the code base, but not right at this moment. However, useful to-dos can be, they're not an excuse to leave bad code in the system. So you can't just write some bad code, name some stuff very off and terribly, and just have a to-do there. You should still make every effort to fix that certain bad code. But if you know that, hey, this implementation is a little bit off, or hey, you're writing a query. This query is a little bit slow. Write a to-do. Hey, we're going to come back to this maybe in the next sprint or whenever we have more time, more free time to get some developers working on this. Another use case for comments. And when you write to-dos, you actually, I should have given an example of this, but you do your // like you're writing a comment, and then you write to-do, just like that in all caps, to-do. And it should actually change color. I know in IntelliJ it does that. It changes to like yellow from, like you see here when you comment, it's gray. It should change to like a yellow, and the whole line will change yellow. So amplification. Moving on. A comment can be used to amplify the importance of something that may otherwise seem inconsequential. And as you can see here, when you first look at the first line, the first comment, and it says important, okay, maybe some bells and whistles are going off in your mind, and you think, oh, okay, maybe I should stop and really think about this, or really, really read this, or be careful with these next few lines of code. So it says there, this method assumes non-negative input values. Now that I would say that's a pretty good clarification comment, and it's amplifying the fact that, hey, just by reading the calculate factorial function here, the method here, you can't really tell from that whoever wrote that is intending you on using values that are greater than 0. So maybe users might be inclined, or you might be inclined, to use negative numbers because it doesn't explicitly say so unless you read the comment. So this could be a good use of a comment to amplify the importance of using specific arguments for this function. Oh, now bad comments. And there's a lot of examples of bad comments. So you don't want to have redundancy, and you don't want to have mumbling. And these two concepts kind of go hand in hand a little bit. So mumbling is basically plopping in a comment because you feel like it. Very bad practice. Very bad practice. So if you are going to write a comment, write the best comment you can, but you don't want to leave something just because. You want to leave something just because it's a funny joke, and Uncle Bob gives some examples in the code of people like making jokes with their comments. Like, it's just clutter. It's just fluff. You don't want that in there. And if you're in a hurry, you don't want to leave comments, because seemingly when you're in a hurry, maybe you're not naming things. You're not taking the time to name things very descriptively. So you're using just generic sounding names. And then that's why you leave comments. You don't want to do that either. You want to feel rushed. And maybe sometimes when you do feel rushed, that's when you use comments as like the kind of crutch for those sort of situations. But no mumbling and no redundancy. So providing comments when the code provides sufficient enough information. So this was like an example a few slides ago. I kind of argued it was the calculate average function. You probably don't need the comments there because everything is explained from the function name and the arguments being passed in the function. I can pretty much infer what's going to happen in that function. Pretty much. And the extra comments, like that whole block there, probably not needed. And a hard and fast rule here is if your comment is saying the same thing as the code itself, you probably don't need the comment. So just something to keep track of. Misleading comments. This.closed is true. So going back to something I said earlier where you could have potentially comments that are older than the code itself, and then the comments themselves become misleading and very confusing because they no longer are attached to the new code that is written. You have this function here. So you have a utility method that returns when this.closed is true, and it throws an exception if the timeout is reached. So wait for close. You've got if closed, if not closed, wait. And then you have a nested if within it. That's probably not a great thing. Just judging based on some stuff we've said earlier about functions, you don't want to have too many indentations, and right now we have 2. So maybe that might be a little much. You might want to break out the other if into its own other function, but that's a separate issue. So it returns when this.closed is true. But here's the thing, guys. This is the first thing I noticed. This is a void method, which means it's not going to return anything. So that's what confuses me about this comment. Returns when this.closed is true. So when this.closed is true, it's not going to go in this if block. It's not going to go in this if block. So what's it returning here? It's a very confusing comment. It's a very misleading comment because nothing's being returned here. So Uncle Bob says, hey, if you're going to write a comment, write the best comment you can. Don't make it misleading. And don't overdo it with the comments. But to go along with the goal of this slide, just don't make your comments misleading and don't make them confusing. Mandated comments. So there are times where maybe you have to have comments. So you shouldn't have a rule that requires every function to have a Javadoc. This could lead to confusion. This could cause clutter. But if you look at Javadocs, like if you keep clicking and clicking into function names, eventually you'll get to some Javadocs. Like if you do like click into the toString method or the dot equals method, you'll get Javadocs. Now the Javadocs do have comments that look kind of like this. And for those purposes, okay, maybe comments are important or needed. When you go down to the very root of methods that are available in your JDK, and for the people who have written and worked on Java and other open source projects, yes, maybe comments are going to be needed and mandated for that. But other than that, for the sake of your code repositories, you shouldn't need to generate Javadocs for your functions, for your classes, etc., according to Uncle Bob. It's going to cause clutter. It's going to lead to confusion. In the end, default to just naming your functions, your variables, classes, what have you, just a little bit better. Journal comments. Long story short, not needed. Journal comments are basically a log of every change that has been made in that file. So you can see there in the example, okay, on this date, we updated this logic, we added a conditional statement, we also added this. Not needed anymore. It just clutters it up. It adds to the file size, and we have source and version control for this now. Maybe there was a time where these sorts of comments were needed, and you essentially had a log of everything that was changed in the file at a certain date and by who. But now you can just look in GitHub, and you can see what commits were pushed up. You can see who made the commits at what time, and you can see what they changed and the differences between the files. So journal comments, no longer really needed. Noise comments, not really needed. So basically, noise comments are stating the obvious. Hey, you have a private int variable that's called day of the month, and then you have a comment that says, oh, this is the day of the month. Self-explanatory, probably not needed. And you should get rid of that. Replace the need to provide noise in your code. You don't want noise. You want your code to essentially do the talking. Continuing on, don't use a comment where you can use a function or variable, something that we stated earlier. If you can rewrite your code to get rid of the comments, do it. Sometimes devs leave a comment first and then write the code to cover it. I'm pretty sure I've done this before where I'll actually make notes in the file and then I'll write my functions or classes or what have you to kind of match up with my notes. But then I forget to sometimes kind of go back and delete the comments, which is what you should totally do, because now that the code is written, assuming that you've named it properly, you followed the conventions we've talked about in the first 3 chapters, that comment is no longer needed, and you can feel free to get rid of it and just not have nearly as much noise in your code. Positional markers. Another potential use case for comments, but one that is not really needed. This is basically marking the position of a particular string of code in a file. It can get very noisy. It can get very noisy and annoying. Just look at that example right there. Actions, like tons of slashes. Basically marking a section in the code where, hey, these are all the action methods. Or maybe you have a comment, bunch of slashes like I'm doing in that second sub-bullet point, that says, oh, these are all my getters. Okay, this is the section where there's all my setters. This is the section where I'm doing all my division. This is the section where I'm doing all my subtraction. So you're dividing up your file using comments, and you're illustrating or you're pointing to the dev, hey, where in this file are certain actions located, certain methods located, etc. And Uncle Bob says that's not really needed. Only really use this when the benefit is super, super significant. So maybe I could think of if your file is just super, super long, 1,000 lines, 2,000 lines. Yeah, maybe this would be needed because then you could just search for it. You could just search for the section header, actions, and then it would go straight there, and that way you know. But then that would also require some communication to your team. Hey, these are the sections that are within this file, just so everybody else knows. Another potential way that these positional markers could be used is for comments on closing braces. So if you see in this example here, there's a comment down here that says end for loop. And it's kind of like a good marker. I've seen this at work a little bit, where people will comment on the closing brace that aligns with the certain loop or the certain function that it's closing. This can actually kind of be somewhat helpful, especially if your function or your for loop is super, super long and you're trying desperately to find, gosh, where does this even end? I don't even know where this starts and ends. These types of comments indicating where something ends, where a function ends, or where a loop ends could be potentially beneficial. But also, knowing Uncle Bob a little bit just from reading his book, maybe he would tell you, hey, that function is too long. Or, hey, that loop, you have too many indentations, too many abstractions. Make your function just do one thing. You won't need to have it be so long, and you won't need that comment indicating where it ends. Continuing forward, attributions and bylines. Again, another example of using comments where they are not really needed anymore just due to version control systems that we have today, GitHub, Bitbucket, what have you. Version control is better at letting you know who changed the code and when. So sometimes people can maybe use comments to, again, indicate, oh, who changed this piece of code, kind of like what we did with the journal comments earlier. This is basically the same thing, but again, Uncle Bob says you don't need it. You have version control systems for this. You have GitHub. You can see who changed the code at what time and what they changed. Does a much better job than your comments do. Commenting out code, don't do it. Just simply put, don't do it. And if you do it, just delete it. Don't leave the code that is commented out, just delete it. what ends up happening is that people will often wonder if it is very important. Nobody's going to end up deleting it, and it's just going to stay put in your code repository forever and ever, leaving people to feel confused as to what it actually is. And because people don't know what it is, they're not going to delete it, so on and so forth. So again, if you're going to comment out code that is no longer needed, just delete that code. Don't leave it commented. If you do at some point need to go back to that piece of code, save it somewhere. I sometimes save blocks of code just on the MacBook in their Notes application, or you have, again, version control. You can go back and look at previous versions of the file, and you can revert back to that version. You can just take those pieces and copy and paste them back in the code. HTML comments, simply put, do not have HTML comments in your source. Do not have HTML in your source code comments. Sorry. So you see here, this is kind of like a documentation or clarification comments, kind of explaining what calculate sum is going to do, but it's within the context of HTML. So think about the use case for this calculate sum. It's essentially trying to paint you the picture of what this would look like in a UI, where you just have a blank screen, you have two inputs, and then a button that says add. So you can input one number in the one text box, another number in the next text box, and then click add. It's going to calculate the sum. That's essentially what this HTML is made to do. Paint the picture of a user interface that would utilize this calculate sum function. And Uncle Bob says basically don't have HTML in your source code comments. To go along with common theme from this chapter, it clutters up your file. It could potentially cause confusion. Like when I first looked at this, I don't think I've ever really seen HTML like this in source code comments, like at work and stuff. So this kind of confused me just off the bat looking at it. And it's just kind of a lot. It's not really needed. If you're going to leave a comment here, maybe you would just take that first line that says this method calculates the sum of two numbers. But again, I think that function is named properly, and I get the gist of it just from reading the function name. This comment might not even really be needed. Non-local information. So if you have a local scope, like you have comments in a particular class, let's say you have a car class, and you have comments in that car class that talk about system-wide information that is not even pertaining to the car, but to the app as a whole. Uncle Bob says you shouldn't have that. If you're going to write a comment, write the best comment you can. Don't include system-wide information in the context of a local file. So in your car class, you have a comment that says, oh, the default port the app runs is on 8082. Very true. Like that statement it's probably not false. Your app, when you run it locally, does run on port 8082, but why do you have it in your car class? Why do you have it over your method public void sum two numbers? Doesn't make sense to have it there. So maybe there's a need for this somewhere, but it's not in the car class. So just keep that in mind. Don't offer system-wide information in the context of a local comment. And then again, just as far as redundancy, don't give too much information in your comments. Don't put a historical history book in your comments of everything that was changed in this file. Again, to go along with attributions and journal comments. You don't need a history book in your file. You have version controls for that, according to Uncle Bob. Continuing forward. Inobvious connection. Yes, sir. So don't have comments that then also need an explanation. I've said this before. I'll say it again. I love this quote. If you're going to write a comment, write the best comment you can. Don't write a comment that causes somebody to then need an explanation for that comment. If you write a comment, a programmer should be able to read the comment and understand what is going on. Same thing if you just name your functions or variables properly and descriptively as you can. Obviously, yes, it's going to be hard to do that every single time, but if you write a comment really well, it should stand on its own and the person should get the gist of it. Same thing to be said for function headers. No need for a comment. Calculate sum. No real need for a comment for that. That's what I kind of said in a couple slides ago. If a function is small, just name it really, really well. If it does one thing, just name it really, really well. No need for a comment or to describe what that function is doing. And then last slide here, Javadocs and non-public code. Javadocs are best used for public APIs, like I said. In the JDK, if you keep clicking into some of the methods within the JDK, dot equals, dot toString, dot length, dot size. Is dot length? That might be a property. I don't know if that's a function, but it's still, you can click in till you get to the Javadocs. For public APIs, Javadocs go well because a whole bunch of people across the country, across the world are going to be using those methods. But in your code that is private, Javadocs are generally not very useful. Again, they clutter up the code base. There's better ways to let your team or users know what the class is doing, namely by just naming things a little bit better. Javadocs in the code, I think Uncle Bob kind of explains it like this. It just offers clutter, makes them a little bit too long. And they're generally best served for public APIs. If your code is super private, you don't need documentation for that. Yes, have documentation for your repository and what it does, etc., but just not within the code itself. You can use Confluence, Atlassian, Jira for things like that. Confluence maybe would be better, or just Word docs. I've done that before too. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, that is going to do it for Chapter 4. All about comments. If you're going to write a comment, write the best comment you can. That's the best. That's the number one thing I learned from this chapter. Thank you guys very much for listening. I really, really appreciate it. Next time, we're going to talk about formatting. I don't know if that'll be this upcoming week. I might take a week off from the video. So within the next 2 weeks, we'll do Chapter 5. Check out my new interview with Adam Fitzgerald. The clips are coming out right now, and then the full interview is out June 12th, which is the longest interview I've done so far. 2.5 hours, I think it was, or very close to 2.5 hours. And I'm going to get him back on again. Adam is a researcher into Middle Eastern geopolitical things, researcher into the events of September 11th, and he's a guy I've been following for a few years now. Lots of great information, very interesting interview. And then we've got other interviews. I've got a lot of interviews I still got to release, and then some other people I'm reaching out to. So check out the podcast. It's on just same name, Chee-Tash Podcast. It's on Spotify, Apple, Google, Amazon, Samsung, and then a couple other places, but those are the big ones, YouTube. And yeah, thank you guys so much. 600 subscribers, although we lost one yesterday, but we're still at 600. So thank you guys so much. My name is Chris. This is Chee-Tash. Take care, everybody.